The saying goes that the best defense is a good offense. Vladimir Putin has spent months taking advantage of NATO not following that idiom. By launching dozens of hybrid warfare attacks ranging from drone incursions to sabotage operations in NATO member states, Putin has brought the fight to NATO, believing that his enemy won't respond until Russian troops start moving in. But Putin may have overplayed his hand. Now NATO is gearing up to fight back. NATO's preemptive threat to Russia is ramping up as the organization increasingly believes that attacking first is justified. Putin's hybrid warfare backfires hard as NATO considers everything that he does an act of aggression that justifies a powerful, preemptive response. On December 1st, The Telegraph was among several outlets that reported on comments made by Admiral Giuseppe Cavo Dragone. The head of NATO's military committee, Dragone says that now may be the time for NATO to consider taking more aggressive measures against Russia as a response to the hybrid threat that Putin and his legions of hackers, saboteurs, and drone operators pose. It's time for NATO to become proactive, Dragone claims, as he states, being more aggressive or being proactive instead of reactive is something that we are thinking about. The commander adds that a preemptive strike of some description is becoming an increasingly viable option in the current climate, and that such a strike could be considered a defensive action due to everything that Russia has been doing to harm NATO in recent months. Dragone adds that this type of thinking was further away from our normal way of thinking and behavior than usual. But that may be what NATO needs right now. After all, reactive deterrence doesn't seem to be working against Russia. NATO has always been a reactive force rather than one that takes a proactive response to anybody who threatens the organization's members. This reactivity seems to be baked into the NATO way of doing things, as we see from Article 5 of the NATO Charter. That article says that all NATO members will aid any single member that is the victim of an attack on its own soil, which is as reactive an approach as an organization can have. NATO won't attack first, this article and the many others in the NATO Charter appear to say. It will only respond in kind against an enemy that attacks NATO. Even analytical articles covering NATO and its many initiatives often focus on the importance of reaction time ahead of going on the offense. For instance, a December 2, 2024 piece by Richard D. Hooker Jr., which was published by the Atlantic Council, made the point that NATO has fielded the NATO Response Force, or NRF, for many years. Under that force lies the Very High Readiness Joint Task Force. Those forces need to react faster, Hooker Jr. suggests, but that approach may be part of the NATO problem. Again, this is all language that tells you exactly how NATO responds to conflict. Response and readiness aren't the kinds of words that a military force that is prepared to go on the attack would use. NATO is communicating a clear message to anybody who might stand against it. NATO reacts, it doesn't attack. Dragone appears to be stating that this type of thinking needs to change, which leads us to the clear question. What has prompted this change in thinking? The Telegraph implies that the current state of peace talks between Russia and Ukraine, with US involvement, may have something to do with it. It points to comments made by Kaja Kallas, who is the Vice President of the European Commission and one of the European Union or EU's leading diplomats. Kallas says this is a pivotal week for the Ukraine war peace talks, not only because of the impact those talks will have on Ukraine, but due to the implications for the entire European continent. It could be a pivotal week for diplomacy, Kallas says when referring to talks between the US and Russia that are set to take place on December 2nd. And the reason, Kallas adds, is that these talks risk piling all the pressure on Ukraine to come to an agreement with Russia that is in nobody's interest. Kallas has a point. It was only a little over a week ago that the US released what it later claimed was a draft for a peace plan that appeared to be far more pro-Russian than anybody expected. The 28-point plan has already been analyzed and adapted by members of the EU and Ukraine itself, but it may also form the basis of the upcoming talks between the US and Russia. Check out our video covering the original US plan and its implications to discover why Kallas is so concerned about upcoming peace talks piling more pressure on Ukraine to accept a bad deal. Questions have to be asked about how serious Russia is about considering any form of peace in Ukraine. As the Moscow Times reported on December 1st, Putin is set to meet with several US officials, including Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff, on December 2nd. The billionaire developer will be joined by Jared Kushner, who is the US President Donald Trump's son-in-law, to discuss a redrafted peace framework that the US drafted alongside Ukraine in Geneva following the unveiling of America's original peace plan. Presumably, this new plan is one that Ukraine would accept. But if Ukraine is willing to accept the plan that will be presented to Putin, it's unlikely that Putin will say yes. Bear in mind that it was only a month ago that Russia was telling the world that there was no need for it to hold any talks with the US. Putin's mouthpiece, Dmitry Peskov, said, "Hypothetically, it's possible, but there's no need for it right now. At the moment, there is need for very painstaking work on the details of the settlement issue." That's obviously changed now, but the reason why might be that Russia believes that it can negotiate the US back toward the original 28-point plan that it presented. This is what Callas means when she calls this a pivotal week for the future of Ukraine and Europe. Without outwardly saying so, she is concerned that the US will backtrack on whatever concessions it made to Ukraine in Geneva, returning its plan to a place that makes it impossible for Ukraine to accept. The pressure will be piled on, and when Ukraine inevitably says no, Russia's hybrid war will intensify against Europe's NATO members. The traditional war Putin is waging against Ukraine has remained intense, regardless of the upcoming talks with the US. On December 1st, almost as if to make a direct mockery of the talks that are scheduled to happen a day later, Russia launched yet another airstrike. This time, the Dnipro region was Putin's target. Reuters reports that at least 4 people are dead, with another 40 being wounded. Several businesses, including car service stations, an office building, and 49 cars were also damaged in Russia's terrible attack. These are not the actions of a president who is even considering peace. They're the actions of a warmonger, and that's what the likes of Callas and Dragoni are worried about. Though the former sees this week as pivotal for the Ukraine war peace talks, that may not mean that she believes the meeting between the US and Russia will bear fruit. The opposite may be true, which brings us back to Dragoni and his claims that NATO needs to take a proactive and preemptive approach to Russia. After all, Russia is already waging a conventional war against Ukraine, but for just about as long, he's been waging a hybrid war against the rest of Europe. That brings us to the second reason for the change in NATO thinking, which may be that there hasn't really been a change at all. Yes, Dragoni is arguing for proactivity. However, the reality that NATO faces is that Russia has been at war with the collective defense organization for months, if not years. It's just not the type of war that can be recognized as a traditional conflict. Instead, Russia has been trying to destabilize NATO and its European nations in particular, with a series of hybrid attacks that include threats, aerial incursions, cyberattacks, and much more. Make no mistake about the fact that these hybrid tactics are as much acts of war as tanks rolling into a country, so the proactivity that Dragoni calls for may not be true proactivity at all. It would still be reactive, as these hybrid tactics justify the perhaps inaccurately termed preemptive strikes that are increasingly becoming part of NATO's thinking. Many are calling out what Putin is doing for what it really is. For instance, the European Policy Centre, or EPC, published an article on October 9th that suggested that the many aerial incursions that Russian drones and fighter jets have made over the Baltic region aren't mere threats. They amount to a rehearsal for a war that Russia is far more ready to wage than NATO. According to the EPC, these repeated violations of NATO airspace show us that Russia has already taken a more offensive posture against Europe's NATO members, and it's NATO that has been remarkably slow to react to that fact. Specifically, these claims come from Maria Martushuta, who is a policy analyst with the EPC. Against the backdrop of Russia's repeated airspace violations, NATO faces pressing choices. Its room for maneuver, legal, political, and military, is now under discussion both in NATO and the EU. Martushuta writes, "Unless NATO and the EU take composed but forceful action, Russian aerial violations in the Baltic region risk escalation, with possible fatalities." As if to drive the EPC analyst's point home, Russia has recently sent more of its aerial assets into Romanian airspace. On November 25th, The Guardian reported that NATO had been forced to scramble its jets once again, this time to track a pair of Russian drones that crossed into Romania's territory. One of these drones was later found downed about 70 miles away from Romania's border with Ukraine, making this the deepest incursion that Russia has dared to make in Romania to date. Putin is getting bolder with these aerial incursions, which began in earnest in early September, when Russia sent around 21 of its Gebera drones into Polish airspace. The point here, and perhaps the one that Dragoni and Martushuta are making, is that the Russian hybrid threat is both very real and growing. How long can NATO wait until it does something more than scrambling jets to deal with these kinds of issues? Will it wait until the first death is recorded as a result of Russia's actions? By then it might be too late. The Centre for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA, argued in a November 25th piece that it was about time that the EU in particular started making Russia's hybrid attacks a priority. CEPA says that the Kremlin's current tactics, though escalated, are nothing new. Russia has been poking at the collective EU and NATO fabrics for at least a decade through a series of cyberattacks, disinformation, and economic manipulation. CEPA argues that the EU needs to create a hybrid threat policy that should make dealing with these threats a priority. It suggests a deterrence by punishment approach which aligns somewhat with Dragone's claims that NATO needs to become more proactive. A list of Russia's vulnerabilities should also be created, SIPA argues, presumably with the goal of exploiting those vulnerabilities when necessary. Elections need to be protected, disinformation must be countered, and the general message must be sent to Putin that if he messes with the European bull, he'll be getting the horns. Ultimately, the reason for Dragone's comments and the potential shift in NATO thinking is twofold. Putin shows no signs of being interested in any form of peace that will be fair to Ukraine. That means the Ukraine war will continue, resulting in Europe supporting Ukraine, which will only lead to yet more hybrid attacks being carried out by Russia. Striking now, when things haven't quite gone so far as a conventional or lethal attack, may be better than waiting until Putin believes that Russia has the upper hand. Russia, of course, isn't too happy about Dragone's comments. On December 1st, Newsweek reported that Russia has already struck back at any implication that NATO will become more aggressive. Maria Zakharova, who is a spokesperson for Russia's foreign ministry, has already labeled Dragone's statements as an extremely irresponsible step, indicating the readiness of the alliance to continue to move toward escalation. Zakharova said this as her president launched more missiles and drones at Ukraine, and only days after 2 Russian drones entered Romania. Irony doesn't appear to be Zakharova's strong point. Willful ignorance, on the other hand, the Kremlin has that in spades. Zakharova is joined by Mikhail Sharamet, who is a Russian State Duma deputy representing the occupied Crimean Peninsula in Russia. According to the Russian news agency TASS, Sharamet has also lambasted Dragone for his remarks, stating, "Sometimes NATO's leadership displays a primitive, aggressive mindset that is both astonishing and perilous. Their reckless, self-assured statements threaten not only their own populations, but also global stability. Any preemptive strike by NATO would be akin to pulling the trigger on themselves, an act that could entail catastrophic consequences." That statement is right out of the Russian playbook. Claim that everybody else is at fault but Russia, and then issue a vague threat designed to intimidate an enemy into thinking that Russia will escalate if it doesn't get its way. It's precisely these kinds of tactics that have led to Dragone stating that NATO needs to take a proactive approach, as Russia will keep using them until it learns that it can no longer get away with them. However, the one thing that is missing from Dragone's comments, at least those that we've shared so far, is any real indication of what a preemptive NATO strike against Russia would look like. Nobody knows what this proactive action means for sure, though it appears almost completely certain that Dragone isn't saying that NATO needs to send the big guns into Russia itself and start an all-out war. Rather, he seems to be implying that NATO needs to start countering Russia's hybrid threats with similar actions of its own as part of a wider policy designed to show Putin that NATO isn't going to wait and respond only when the Russian threat grows so large and that it's forced to do so. We get an inkling of this from further comments Dragone made, which are shared by The Independent. Dragone specifically mentions Russia's cyber threat, stating, "On cyber, we're kind of reactive. Being more aggressive or being proactive instead of reactive is something that we're thinking about." The implication here seems to be that NATO should either start the same sort of hacking campaigns that Russia uses to disrupt the states it targets, or perhaps in a wiser move, NATO should be launching cyber attacks against those in Russia that it knows are aiding Putin in the cyber aspect of his hybrid warfare campaign. Interestingly, November 27th saw Politico publish an article in which it claimed that Europe thinks the unthinkable when it comes to retaliating against Russia. The outlet published this article days before Dragone made his comments, suggesting that the shift in approach that Dragone says is becoming a more attractive idea within NATO is more than just one man suggesting that more needs to be done against Russia. Politico notes that several European nations are already working on various retaliatory ideas, including joint offensive cyber operations targeting Russia. It says that Italy's defense minister, Guido Crosetto, has recently published a 125-page missive in which he suggests the creation of a European Centre for Countering Hybrid Warfare. That organization would include a cyber force with 1,500 members, along with military personnel who specialize in the use of artificial intelligence. Politico also points out that several NATO members, including the Czech Republic and Denmark, already allow their militaries to conduct offensive cyber operations. These countries could work together to target systems that are critical to Russia's war effort, such as economic zones and drone production facilities. Perhaps Dragone's mention of being more proactive on the cyber front isn't the casual aside it first appears to be. He may be saying that NATO's members, especially those that already authorize offensive cyber operations, should be hitting Russia as hard as Russia is hitting them on the cyber front. The Economic Times expands on Dragone's comments, noting that the NATO commander also said, "Launching a preventative action against a site where drones could be ready to be launched against NATO could be an option." Notice the careful use of the word action and not strike. It seems that Dragone might agree with Politico's assessment that Europe's cyber teams could be used to wreak havoc at Russian drone production facilities without NATO having to send in the jets to bomb those facilities to oblivion. This is the sort of preemptive strike that would make sense from a NATO standpoint. Russia wouldn't be able to vilify NATO for launching bombs and missiles, as Putin is seemingly so desperate to do, to give himself an excuse for a more conventional war against NATO. Rather, NATO would use Russia's own hybrid tactics against it, taking out drone production facilities that are already building weapons that Russia is using to terrorize NATO states in the process. Russia has certainly gone all in on long-range drone production. In September, the Kyiv Independent reported that Russia is now at the point where it can build up to 2,700 Shahid-type drones per month. Right now, most of those drones are being used in Ukraine, but Russia has already sent some of its Shahid types into NATO airspace, and it will likely send more as production ramps up further. Nipping this production in the bud with a preemptive attack of some kind may be just what Dragone says NATO is thinking about doing. But again, this is all speculation based on comments that NATO's military committee head has made. There is a caveat to this seeming change in NATO's thinking, and Dragone himself brings it up. The Independent reports Dragone as stating, "Being more aggressive compared with the aggressivity of our counterpart could be an option. The issues are legal framework, jurisdictional framework. Who is going to do this?" Cynics might say that this is the eternal NATO problem. The red tape that bogs the organization down may strike again, which is precisely what Putin wants to happen. NATO has to find a way to justify any sort of proactive action, in addition to finding members that are willing to potentially place themselves in Russia's firing line with these kinds of preemptive strikes. But then again, the point has already been made that many NATO members are already being targeted by Putin's hybrid warfare. So the real question may not be who. It may be when will the NATO members that Putin is targeting say enough is enough and start delivering a healthy dose of the Kremlin's own medicine right back to Russia. NATO may not have long to turn Dragone's call to action into executable policy. Russia is already attacking NATO, and those attacks are all part of a wider plan that will lead to the conventional kind of war that Putin is waging in Ukraine. Phase 0 proves it, and you can find out what that is and why it suggests that a Russian attack on NATO is imminent in our video. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more videos discovering NATO's ever-evolving efforts to deter Putin from war. And thank you as always for watching.